The radio on Pritchard's belt crackled something about a structure fire on Route 9 and he didn't move. He was watching her hands. She had placed them on the door, both of them, palms flat against the warm metal of the car door the way people do when they are trying to demonstrate that they understand the protocol. She'd done it before he said anything. That irritated him, the way a person who moves too fluidly through a thing they should be nervous about can irritate you. "License and registration," he said. "I already gave you those." "I'm asking again." She turned her head slowly, not snapping it. She looked at him the way you'd look at something on the ground you weren't sure was a rock or a bird. Then she reached through the window without another word and opened the glove compartment and came back with the registration card and held it out. He didn't take it right away. Behind them, on the county road that cut between two soybean fields brown and stubbled from the October harvest, there was no traffic. The sky was white and low, the kind of October sky that Louisiana gets in the weeks before something colder finally decides to move in. Her car, a 2019 Honda Accord Silver Immaculate, sat on the gravel shoulder with the hazards going. He told her to put on the hazards. She'd done that too before he finished the sentence. "You got anything in the vehicle I should know about?" "No." "You're sure?" "Yes." He stood there another moment, one hand on the roof of the car, and she watched the registration card bend slightly in the wind between her fingers and said nothing. He took it, finally, and went back to the cruiser. Through the rear view she could see him in the driver's seat, not doing anything, just looking at his phone. 5 minutes passed, then 7. When he came back, he said her tags were expired. She said they weren't. He said he had reason to believe they were. She said, "My renewal is current. I have the documentation in the glove box if you'd like to see it." He didn't want to see it. He walked around the car anyway, slowly, the way a person walks when they are buying time and know it and don't care that you know it. He looked at the rear lights. He looked at the tires. He scuffed at the front bumper with his boot, not hard, just touching it. Then he came back to the driver's window. "Step out of the vehicle, please." Her name was Mara Collier, and she was 34 years old, and she opened the car door and stepped out. She'd grown up in Carver Parish, though barely anyone who knew her then still lived there. Her father had worked timber until his back gave out, and her mother, who was 71 now and had the beginning edges of something the doctors were calling mixed dementia, but which Mara privately thought was more grief than disease, still lived in the same house on Millard Street where Mara had spent her childhood. The house had a front porch with a warped board that had been warped since Mara was 8, and a mimosa tree that her mother had planted the year Mara's brother left for the Marines and never came back the same way. Mara had gone to LSU, stayed in Baton Rouge for 2 years after graduation, moved to Nashville for another 8 working compliance, and then audit for a regional insurance group. She was good at the work in a way that had nothing to do with caring about it. She had a methodical brain and a very high tolerance for tedium, which is more useful in audit than any amount of passion. She could read a log and see the shape of behavior in it the way some people hear melody in what sounds to others like noise. She noticed patterns. She noticed when something that should be consistent wasn't, when an absence was doing as much work as a presence, when numbers lined up too neatly or not neatly enough. She'd come back to Carver Parish 14 months ago when her mother's situation got complicated. She told herself it was temporary. She still told herself that. The town itself, Dorrit, Louisiana, population 8,200 on the welcome sign, though the sign was old, was the kind of place that had been declining in a specific and largely unremarked way for 20 years. The mill had closed in 2009. A Dollar General had replaced the pharmacy on Main Street. The courthouse was being renovated with federal money that seemed to arrive and then evaporate without much changing. There were nice people in Dorrit, and there were also people who had been left with not much except the authority they'd managed to accumulate, and that combination was always the most dangerous thing about a small place. Dale Pritchard had been a deputy with the Carver Parish Sheriff's Department for 19 years when he made sergeant, and he'd been a sergeant for 4. He was 46, thick through the shoulders, and had hair that was still dark except for a strip of gray at each temple that he was privately proud of because it made him look, he thought, more like an authority and less like someone who'd been stationed at the same post for a long time out of inertia. He owned 2 trucks and a bass boat and a house out on Simmons Lake that he'd bought with his wife, Deborah, 17 years ago when interest rates were what they were. He coached his son's rec league football on Saturday mornings in the fall, and he was generally well liked by the other coaches and the parents who showed up. And he knew everyone at the Pelican, which was the bar attached to the bowling alley on Highway 12, where the department more or less kept a standing table on Friday evenings after the 3 to 11 shift. He believed himself to be a fair man. The belief was genuine. Most people's beliefs about themselves are. He had a way with traffic stops that he'd developed over the years, a kind of proprietary calm that he knew could tip into something else if the situation called for it, and he knew how to read the moment when it needed to tip. He told himself he read it accurately. That was where the problem lived, though he would not have called it a problem, he would have called it experience. He'd pulled Mara Collier because her brake light was out. That part was real. The left rear brake light was indeed out. She'd discover this 2 days later and replace it in the AutoZone parking lot in 11 minutes. And he followed her for 3/4 of a mile before he hit the lights, which was longer than 3/4 of a mile required. But by then he'd run the plate and seen that the address was Millard Street, which was not a part of Dorrit he associated with simplicity, and he was already arranging his day around the stop. She was standing beside the car when he got back to her. She was wearing dark slacks and a cream-colored blouse and flat shoes, her hair pulled back, nothing remarkable about her except the quality of her stillness. Most people move during a traffic stop the way water moves when you've disturbed it, little ripples of anxiety going out from the center. She was still. "I'm going to need to take a look inside the vehicle," he said. "You don't have consent for that," she said. She didn't say it dramatically. She said it the way she might have said "the light in here is pretty bad," or "I think that's a different form," just a statement. He felt something shift in his chest, a tightening that was not anger but was adjacent to it. "I have reason to believe the vehicle may contain contraband." "What reason?" "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to step back to the rear of the vehicle while I conduct my search." She took a step back, then she turned and looked down the road in both directions. There was nothing in either direction. She clasped her hands loosely in front of her and stood there. His body camera was running. He'd activated it when he first approached, which was policy, and it was clipped to the front of his shirt and the lens was pointed at her. He knew this. He moved through the interior of her car with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it hundreds of times, and he had. He checked the center console, the glove box, the rear seat, the floor mats. He pulled the car's owner's manual out from under the passenger seat and flipped through it, which he sometimes did just to make the point that he was thorough. He popped the trunk from the interior latch and walked back to look at it. A reusable grocery bag, a folded rain jacket, a cardboard box from Office Depot with a ream of printer paper still in the shrink wrap. He shut the trunk. She was looking at him with that same level quality when he came around. No anger in her face. No relief either, which was what most people showed when you didn't find anything, that quick release that traveled up through the shoulders and into the eyes. She just looked at him. "I'm going to issue you a citation for the non-functioning brake light," he said. "Okay. And I want to note that your conduct during this stop was," he paused, working through it, "uncooperative." "I didn't refuse anything you asked me to do," she said. "You gave me attitude." She looked at him for a moment. A truck went by on the road. The sound of it came and went. "Okay," she said. He wrote the citation standing beside her car, and she stood there, and the body camera recorded the highway and the soybean fields and the back of her head and the way she held herself, which was straight and very quiet. He handed her the citation. She took it with both hands, looked at it briefly, folded it in half. "You have a good day," she said, and got in her car. He put the still frame up on the department's community Facebook page 9 days later. The post was part of a series the department ran. Sergeant Hendricks had started it 2 years ago. This thing called Keeping Carver Safe, just anecdotal updates, traffic enforcement numbers, the occasional photo from a Dewey checkpoint or a community event. Richard had contributed to it before. He'd put up a photo from a stop in August, just a generic shot of a car pulled to the shoulder, nothing identifying, just the visual of the cruiser's lights and the context. People liked it. They left supportive comments. This time he posted a still frame from his body camera footage. It showed Mara standing at the rear of her car, both hands clasped in front of her, face in 3/4 profile. From that angle in the flat October light, her posture could be read as defiant. That was the word he used in the post, defiant. He wrote that officers in Carver Parish regularly encountered citizens who made routine stops unnecessarily complicated, and that the department was committed to professional enforcement regardless of attitude. He did not name her. He didn't have to name her. The car was visible and the partial plate was visible, and this was Dorrit. By the following morning, 17 people had made the connection. Several of them were people Mara barely knew, acquaintances from the years before she'd left, and a few comments said things that were not subtle. Someone wrote that she always did have a mouth on her. Someone else wrote something about people who moved away and came back thinking they were better than everyone. A man she'd never met wrote a comment that used a phrase he probably thought was clever and wasn't. She read every comment once. She took screenshots. Then she put her phone face down on the kitchen table and made coffee and sat with it while the morning came in through the window over the sink. Her mother was still sleeping. The house smelled like the lavender lotion Mara put on her mother's hands each night, and the particular old house smell underneath it that was mostly wood and decades, and something faintly metallic from the old radiators that didn't work anymore. Outside, the mimosa tree had dropped everything by now. It was just branches. She sat there for a long time. Geneva Tirode was 68 and had taught 4th grade at Dorrit Elementary for 26 years before she retired. She lived 3 houses down from the Colliers on Millard Street, and she had a fig tree in the backyard that produced too much every year, and she always gave Mara jars of the preserves she made from it in the summer. She was a careful woman, soft-spoken, the kind of person who wore the same 4 cardigans in rotation and remembered everyone's birthdays and cried at the end of Saving Private Ryan every time it was on TV, not because she hadn't seen it, but because she had. On an evening in late April, 14 months before Mara's traffic stop, Geneva Tirode had been stopped by Dale Pritchard's cruiser while walking home from the pharmacy on Main Street. She'd been carrying a paper bag with her prescription and a bottle of Epsom salts, and he'd pulled up beside her on the sidewalk and asked where she was going. And when she told him, he asked her to stop walking and put her bag on the hood of the car, and she'd done it, and he'd looked through it and she'd started to cry, and he'd told her there was no reason to be upset and handed her back her bag and driven away. She'd never filed a complaint. She hadn't thought anyone would believe her. She hadn't thought there was a process that existed for her. She told Mara about it on her front porch in August, 6 weeks after Mara had moved back. They were sitting with sweet tea in the late afternoon, and Geneva was talking about something else entirely, and then she wasn't. The story came out the way things come out when people have been holding them for a while, not all at once, but in pieces, with long pauses, and with a particular quality of shame that had nothing to do with anything she'd done. Mara had listened to all of it. She hadn't said that's terrible or you should have reported it or anything at all except tell me what he looked like. Geneva described the patch on the arm, the gray at the temples. Mara went home and made a list in her notebook. The notebook was a plain black composition book, the kind with the marble cover, and she wrote Geneva's name at the top, and underneath it wrote what Geneva had described. The date, the time of day, the street, the nature of the interaction. She wrote it with the same precision she used when she was logging anomalies in a contract review. She was not angry when she wrote it, or not only angry, she was focused. There's a difference. The Freedom of Information request took 11 days to come back, and it came back partial. The department's public records officer, which was actually just the dispatcher who handled administrative mail on Thursday afternoons, sent Mara a response explaining that records pertaining to ongoing investigations were exempt from disclosure, which was accurate, and which also applied by their interpretation to body camera footage from any stop where a citation had been issued, since the citation constituted an active case until the ticket was paid or contested. Mara contested the ticket. This was not a hardship. The citation was for the brake light, and the proper venue was the parish traffic court in Berwick, 40 minutes away. She took a day off work, she was mostly working remotely anyway, and drove to Berwick and sat in the narrow courthouse gallery for 2 hours waiting for her case to be called. The magistrate was a tired-looking man in his late 50s who'd probably heard variations on this same argument from 7 people before lunch. She presented her documentation, she showed her current registration, and when the magistrate asked the officer to present evidence of the brake light malfunction, he produced a handwritten notation in his field notes but no photograph, and the magistrate dismissed the citation. It took 4 minutes. But what it did procedurally was create a closed case, and a closed case changed the disclosure calculus. She filed a new request the following week. While she waited, she started researching the public record of complaints against the Carver Parish Sheriff's Department. These were genuinely public, or at least the aggregate data was in the department's annual report to the parish council, which was posted on the parish website as a PDF. She downloaded 3 years of them. She looked at the columns. She was looking for a pattern in what wasn't there. There were 4 substantiated complaints against department personnel in 3 years. That number was low. It was low in a way that could mean the department was well run, or it could mean that the reporting process was sufficiently discouraging that people weren't using it. She thought about Geneva on the porch, the way she'd looked at her hands when she was talking. She called a woman she'd found through a public Facebook group for Carver Parish community concerns. Someone named Tara Fontenot, who'd posted 14 months ago about a bad traffic stop, and then deleted the post, but not before it had been screenshotted and shared 3 times, and one of those shares was still publicly visible in the cache of a local community group. Mara messaged her through the group, just a short message that said she was compiling information about experiences with the department and would she be willing to talk. Tara called her back within an hour. She was 29 and worked dispatch for a plumbing company in Opelousas, and she drove through Dorrit twice a week on her way to visit her sister. She'd been stopped on a Thursday in August of the year before Mara's return, and the officer had been Pritchard, and what had happened during that stop she hadn't told anyone, she said, except her sister, and she was crying before she got to the part that mattered, which itself told Mara most of what she needed to know. Mara wrote it down. She asked careful questions. She didn't tell Tara what to do. The body camera footage arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the case closure. It came on a USB drive in a manila envelope with the department's return address, and she opened it at the kitchen table while her mother was watching a game show in the other room. She plugged it into her laptop. She watched it. She watched the whole thing, 42 minutes from activation to deactivation, twice through. She didn't fast forward. She watched his face and her own face and the angle of the camera and the quality of the audio. She watched the way he handled her registration card. She watched herself standing at the rear of the car with her hands clasped. She watched him pull the owner's manual from under the passenger seat and flip through it. She watched him pull the shrink-wrapped ream of paper out of the box in the trunk and look at it and put it back. Then she watched the part at the end, the part after he'd come around the car and given her the citation. There was 30 seconds of footage after she got in her car and pulled away where he was still wearing the camera, and he made a comment to himself that she didn't catch entirely the first time through. She rewound. She listened again. He was talking to himself in the specific way people do when they think no one is listening, which with a body camera you never stop doing if you're experienced enough. But the comment was low and almost conversational, and she had to turn her laptop volume up to maximum to make it out. She wrote it down. Then she copied everything onto a backup drive and put the original USB in the zippered pocket of her laptop bag. She put the backup drive in the cardboard box in her closet where she kept her taxes. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division in New Orleans had a community complaint intake process that was listed on their public website. She submitted a complaint form with a summary of the documented incidents. She attached the transcript of the body camera audio with a timestamp notation. She sent it certified mail. She was given a case intake number in a letter 6 weeks later that said an attorney would be in contact. She filed the letter in a folder she kept in the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom. She called the folder Carver Misk. The attorney who eventually contacted her was a woman named Deborah Achilles, and she reached out not by letter but by phone on an afternoon in January, 4 months after the complaint submission. She had a careful, level voice, the kind cultivated over years of delivering information that had to be both clear and neutral. She asked Mara to describe what she'd submitted. Mara described it. There was a pause. "The audio notation you included," Achilles said, "is that from a copy of the body camera footage that you received in response to a records request?"
Yes.
"Do you still have the original drive?"
Yes.
"Is there anything else you've gathered, witness accounts, other documented incidents?" Mara looked at the composition notebook on the table in front of her. It had 70 pages of notes by now. "Yes," she said. Another pause. "Would you be willing to come to New Orleans?" She went to New Orleans on a Friday in late January, driving the Accord down I-10 in the pale cold of the morning. She met Achilles in a federal building conference room that had the specific quality of government conference rooms everywhere: the institutional neutrality, the fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly unwell. Achilles was maybe 45, black, wearing a gray blazer, and she shook Mara's hand with a grip that was solid and businesslike and didn't perform anything. She had a legal pad and a colleague with her, a younger man named Reyes who asked the technical questions about chain of custody and metadata. Myra put the composition notebook on the table. Achilles looked at it. "You've been documenting this for how long?" 14 months. Achilles turned to Reyes. Something passed between them that Mara didn't try to read. Then Achilles picked up the composition notebook and opened it to the first page and began reading. She read for several minutes while Reyes asked Mara the technical questions, and Mara answered them, and the fluorescent light hummed, and somewhere down the hall a copier was running. "Ms. Collier," Achilles said eventually, without looking up from the notebook, "do you understand what a pattern or practice investigation involves?" "I have a general understanding of it." "It means the department itself becomes the subject of investigation, not just an individual officer. It means everything opens up. Every stop, every complaint, every piece of internal communications we can subpoena. It's a long process." "Okay." Achilles looked up. She had eyes that didn't give you much. "You're aware that your name will come up in any proceeding that results from this?" "I'm aware. Some people find that." "I'm aware," Mara said. Spring came slowly that year in Dorrit. The mimosa tree on Millard Street started putting out its feathery pink blossoms in mid-April, which was early, and Mara noticed because her mother had started watching for it from the front window the way she watched for things she could no longer quite name. Some days were better than others. On the bad days, her mother called her by her brother's name, which was James, and Mara would answer to it, and they'd sit together on the porch while the afternoon went the color of old honey and nothing was required of either of them. Mara was still doing her compliance work. She was on a laptop 6 hours a day, reviewing contract variances for a regional hospital group, and she was good at it, and it paid her enough to cover the house and her mother's medications and the part of the home health aid that insurance didn't cover. She had a routine. She'd learned over the months how to be both in Dorrit and somewhere else at the same time, which is the particular skill of people who come from one place and become another. She went to the library on Tuesday evenings. She ran 3 miles on the parish road behind the house on mornings when the humidity wasn't already suffocating. By 6 a.m., she made her mother's coffee the way her mother liked it, which was with exactly 1 spoonful of condensed milk, a habit from her mother's childhood that Mara had always found faintly mysterious. She called Deborah Achilles once a month, and Achilles called her sometimes in between. She didn't tell anyone about the case. Not Geneva, who brought fig preserves in June. Not anyone she knew from her Nashville years. Not the woman from the Facebook group, Tara Fontenot, who texted her sometimes just to check in with a kind of tentative warmth that Mara appreciated more than she knew how to express. There was nothing to tell yet that wasn't still mostly potential, and Mara had learned early in her professional life that the worst thing you could do with an open audit was talk about it before it closed. Pritchard didn't know her name until July. He pulled files sometimes, old stops, not obsessively but occasionally, the way anyone flips back through something when they think they might have missed a detail. He'd thought about the Millard Street stop a few times, not with any particular clarity, just the way certain stops stayed with you, not because they were extraordinary but because they had an odd texture. The woman had been too composed, that was the thing. He told Deborah about it one evening without using the woman's name, just as an anecdote over dinner, the kind of thing cops told their spouses that were half venting and half storytelling. And Deborah had asked what she'd done wrong, and he'd said technically nothing, and Deborah had gone back to her food. He found out her name in July through a chain of events that was both mundane and predictable. One of the guys in the department, a young deputy named Calhoun who'd been there 3 years and was still young enough to be enthusiastic about things he'd eventually stopped being enthusiastic about, mentioned during shift that someone had submitted a complaint to the department about a Facebook post. This was not unusual. Social media complaints happened. The department had a process. But the description of the post, the still frame, the stop on the county road, matched one Pritchard had made, and when he went back and looked, the post had been taken down by whoever ran the department's social media, which was technically Sergeant Hendricks but in practice was Hendricks's wife Bonnie. He asked Calhoun who'd filed the complaint. Calhoun said he didn't know, he'd heard it from dispatch. Pritchard asked dispatch. The dispatcher, who was not supposed to share complaint information and knew it but also didn't have a strong reason to refuse a sergeant in her own department, said it was a Collier address on Millard Street. He looked up the name, he looked up the citation, he sat with it for a few minutes. He told himself it was nothing. People filed complaints. Most complaints went nowhere. He'd had complaints before, 2 of them in 19 years, neither substantiated, and this one would be reviewed by Chief Willard, who had been in the department 24 years and was 4 months from retirement, and had the specific energy of a man doing arithmetic in his head at all times. It would be fine. But he thought about her face, the quality of her stillness. He started driving Millard Street more often, not in any dramatic way, just past slow, the way you drive a road you're watching. He told himself he was doing patrols. He was doing patrols. It was part of the job, he believed this. Mara noticed the increased cruiser presence on Millard Street in August. She noted the dates and times in the composition notebook. She also noticed when the cruiser idled outside the house for 3 minutes on an evening in mid-August while she was on the porch with her mother. She looked at it. She didn't move from the porch chair. Her mother looked at it too, briefly, then looked back at the mimosa tree. "Police car," her mother said. "Yes," Mara said. The cruiser moved on. She called Achilles the next morning and described the pattern. There was a long silence on Achilles' end that was the specific kind of silence that precedes something being said carefully. She told Mara to document everything and to be careful, and she said the phrase potentially relevant to the obstruction consideration in a way that was more informational than alarming. She told Mara not to contact the department directly. Mara hadn't planned to. The federal investigation had been quietly active for 5 months by then. Mara didn't know all of it. Achilles kept her appropriately informed and nothing more. But she knew that records requests had gone out, that the DOJ had obtained the department's complaint database, and that Tara Fontenot had given a sworn statement in June that had taken 3 hours and left Tara shaky and exhausted, but by her account in a text to Mara afterward, relieved in a way she hadn't expected. Another woman from a stop in 2021 that Mara had found through a cross-reference of court records and a dismissed charge that had the same procedural fingerprint as her own, had been located and had agreed to speak with federal investigators. Mara had found the second woman through the kind of methodical research that looks like obsession to people who haven't watched an auditor at work but is really just patience. She'd searched court records which were public for dismissed citations in Carver Parish over a 5-year period. She'd filtered for the officer code on file which appeared in court records as a badge number and cross-referenced the addresses on the citations against a demographic map of the parish that was available on the Census Bureau website. The pattern that emerged was not clean. It was never clean, but it was there. She didn't share this methodology with Achilles unprompted. But when Achilles asked how she'd found the second woman, Mara explained it step by step, and there was a silence on the other end that felt like a specific kind of professional respect, which was its own strange thing to receive. The arrest happened on a Wednesday in early October, which was exactly a year after the traffic stop on the county road. Mara didn't know it was happening when it happened. She was at the kitchen table at 7 in the morning on her second cup of coffee, going through a contract review on her laptop, when her phone buzzed with a text from Achilles that said, "Thought you should know today is the day. You'll likely see it in the news by afternoon." That was all. Mara read it twice, then set the phone on the table. She heard her mother moving in the back bedroom, the soft shuffle of her slippers on the wood floor. She got up and started making her mother's coffee. What she would learn later through the combination of Achilles's briefings and local news coverage was this. At 6:47 a.m., 3 FBI vehicles and 2 subs from the DOJ Civil Rights Unit pulled into the parking lot of the Carver Parish Sheriff's Department on Courthouse Row. Dale Pritchard was already there. He always came in early on Wednesdays to do his weekly activity report before the shift chaos started. He was in the break room with a coffee when Achilles and an FBI special agent named Mara walked in. They were accompanied by 2 more agents and the parish's own undersheriff, who had been briefed the night before and who stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man watching something inevitable. Morrow identified himself. He told Pritchard he was under arrest for federal civil rights violations under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, and for obstruction for the pattern of increased surveillance following the documented complaint. He told him he had the right to remain silent. Pritchard stood up very slowly from the break room table, as if the effort of getting to his feet required careful thought.
He said this is a mistake.
Morrow said, "Sir, please place your hands behind your back." He did. The handcuffs clicked on. They were in a break room in a building he worked in for 23 years, next to a coffee maker that needed descaling and a dry erase board where someone had written "Shift Meeting Thurs" in green marker. One of the other agents picked up his coffee cup and bagged it as evidence because there had been an outstanding question about whether fingerprints on the USB drive from which the Facebook post's metadata had been extracted would be relevant, and they were being thorough. He didn't say anything else until his attorney arrived, which was 4 hours later. The news reached Dorrit the way news reaches small places, not all at once but in a wave that starts in the center and goes out. By noon, the WAFP affiliate out of Baton Rouge had a crew setting up on Courthouse Row. By 2 in the afternoon, the story was on 3 statewide news websites and a regional crime blog. By 6, it was on the local television news, which meant most of the parish had heard something, even if what they'd heard was partial and distorted in the way that early reporting almost always is. The department put out a statement through Chief Willard that said they were cooperating with federal investigators and would have no further comment at this time. Willard looked in the doorway of the department where he read the statement to 2 reporters and a camera, like a man who had 4 months of retirement between himself and all of this, and was counting each day now with a different kind of arithmetic than before. In the comment section of the news story on the regional website, someone wrote that Pritchard was a good man who'd always been fair, and someone else wrote that they knew he had something coming, and a third person wrote something so specific and hateful that it was removed by the moderators within the hour. The comment section was eventually closed. The interrogation room in the federal building in Baton Rouge was smaller than the ones on television and cleaner than the ones in real precincts. Pritchard sat across from Morrow and a federal prosecutor named Garrett Chen, who had the particular quality of stillness that Morrow would have recognized, though they'd never met. Chen had a yellow legal pad and a pen that he didn't use much. He mostly just looked at Pritchard. Pritchard had his attorney with him, a man named Dupreez who practiced in Lafayette and had driven up that morning in a BMW, and who had the slightly rigid affect of someone managing their own anxiety about the case. The interview lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes, and most of what Pritchard said fit into the category of a man explaining himself to himself out loud. He told them about the brake light. He told them the search had been in good faith. He told them the Facebook post was a community safety communication and that he hadn't used her name. He said the subsequent patrol activity on Millard Street was routine. He said that word 2 more times, routine, in a way that suggested he believed if he said it enough it would acquire the weight he needed it to have. Chen let him talk. That was the technique or part of it. Let the person organize their own defense in real time because the act of organizing it reveals the shape of what they know and what they're afraid of. He didn't interrupt. He wrote almost nothing. Then he put a photograph on the table. It was a printout of the still frame from the body camera footage, the same one that had been on Facebook. He put it face up and slid it across the table and said nothing. Pritchard looked at it. "That was a public safety communication," he said again. Chen said, "The timestamp on this photo is from the body camera footage of the October 8th stop. Your department's records indicate you accessed that footage 17 days after the stop. 4 days before this was uploaded to the department Facebook page." Dupreez said, "My client accessed the footage as part of normal case review." "The complaint had already been filed when he accessed it," Chen said, still looking at Pritchard, "which changes the character of the access." There was a silence. "The audio from the footage," Chen said, "we have an enhanced transcript. There's a comment made at the 41-minute mark after Ms. Collier's vehicle has departed." He picked up a paper and read it quietly, not dramatically, just read it the way you'd read an address aloud. Pritchard sat very still. "Is that your voice?" Chen asked. Dupreez said, "My client." Pritchard put his hand on Dupreez's arm. It wasn't aggressive. It was almost gentle. He was looking at the photograph of Mara standing at the rear of her car with her hands clasped. "I've been doing this job for 23 years, he said. I know, Chen said. I never thought I was doing anything that. He stopped, looked at the table.
Chen waited.
I pulled a lot of stops, Pritchard said, most of them. We have records from 43 stops over 5 years that we're looking at, Chen said, and 3 individuals who have given sworn statements.
Dupree said this interview is over.
Pritchard stood up slowly, the way he had in the break room that morning. He moved like a man who had suddenly become aware of his own weight. The federal indictment came down in November. 3 counts of deprivation of rights under color of law, and 1 count of obstruction of a federal investigation, the latter stemming from the documented patrol increase on Millard Street in August, which Achilles' team had triangulated against the department's GPS-linked cruiser logs the department was required to keep, and which they hadn't realized were covered by the federal subpoena until they were. Mara received a copy of the indictment by email from Achilles, the way you might receive a PDF of a utility bill. She read through it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening while the television was on in the other room. She read slowly because she read everything slowly, not because she had difficulty with it but because she didn't like to miss things. She got to count Roman 3, which was the stop that had involved Tara Fontenot, and read the language of it, the formal legal description of what had happened in those minutes on the roadside, and then she put the laptop aside and sat for a few minutes. The television in the next room was a game show with an audience that applauded at regular intervals. The sound of it was somehow more strange than usual. She texted Tara, indictment came down. I wanted you to hear it from me first. Tara texted back immediately, a string of characters that resolved into crying face emojis followed by a single word, okay.
Then thank you.
Then after a minute, is this over now? Mara looked at the question for a moment. She typed not yet, but this part is. Her mother had a bad month in February. The neurologist in Baton Rouge adjusted 2 medications, and there was a week where her mother didn't recognize the house from the inside, which was a specific and terrible thing to witness. The woman wandering from room to room touching the walls as if she was trying to establish contact with something she'd lost the name for. Mara called the home health aide in for extra hours and drove to Baton Rouge twice in 3 weeks and sat across from the neurologist and listened carefully and asked specific questions and wrote the answers down, which the neurologist told her afterward to the nurse was more than most family members managed. She thought about the case sometimes during that month, but only in the way you think about work when you're in the middle of something else at a distance, with the awareness that it was there and ongoing, a process that no longer required her in the daily way it once had. Achilles called her in March to say that the DOJ had also opened a formal pattern or practice investigation of the Carver Parish Sheriff's Department, separate from the criminal proceeding, which would involve a comprehensive audit of all use of force, stops, and complaint data over a 7-year period. An audit? She'd thought when Achilles said the word that there was something briefly darkly funny about it, the particular shape of her skills arriving at this particular place, but she hadn't said that and it wasn't funny exactly, it was just the texture of things. Will you need me for that? She asked. Your composition notebook will be part of the record, Achilles said. You may be deposed again. Okay. How's your mother? Mara looked out the window at the mimosa tree which in March had nothing on it yet, just the dark bare branches against the morning sky. She's having a rough month, she said. I'm sorry to hear that. Thank you for asking, Mara said, which was as much as she could manage. The preliminary hearing was in Federal District Court in Lafayette in April, and the courthouse was not the stone-columned place of movies, but a 7-story glass and concrete building that looked like an insurance company which she found appropriate. She drove down on a Wednesday morning and sat in the gallery of courtroom 4C, and she wore the cream-colored blouse again, which was not a statement or not a conscious one. The fabric was just comfortable, and she'd picked it up off the bed without thinking. Pritchard came in with Dupree's and 2 other men from the defense team. He'd lost weight since October. Not drastically, but the thickness through the shoulders was gone and his face looked smaller. He sat at the defense table without looking at the gallery, which was thin a few reporters, 2 men who might have been from the department or might have been Pritchard's relatives, Mara herself. Achilles and Chen and a paralegal from the DOJ were at the prosecution table. Mara watched Achilles arrange her files with the same careful efficiency she'd shown in the conference room in January a year ago, and felt something she could only describe as being glad, not celebratory, not vindicated, just quietly glad, that this particular person had been on the other end of the phone when she'd needed there to be someone. The hearing was largely procedural. Defense motions regarding the admissibility of the body camera audio, arguments about chain of custody, Chen handling the government's position with the same economy of language he'd used in the interrogation room. Pritchard sat through it all with his hands folded on the table and the expression of a man who had already gone through all the stages of something and arrived at a kind of gray, depleted stillness. He looked up once, not at Mara specifically, just at the gallery, but his eyes moved across the row where she was sitting, and for a moment their line of sight was technically the same. She held his gaze, not aggressively, not to communicate anything in particular, she just didn't look away. His eyes moved on. Her mother died in June, 11 days before the start of the criminal trial. She died at home, which was what she'd wanted, on a morning when the mimosa tree was in full bloom, and the light through the bedroom window was the color that light gets in Louisiana in the early summer, that thick golden quality that makes everything look like a memory while it's still happening. Mara was there. She was holding her mother's hand, which was very small and very warm, and then it wasn't. It was still warm for a while after. She called the doctor. She called the funeral home. She called her mother's sister in Shreveport, and she sat on the porch afterward for a long time while the neighborhood went about its morning, a car going by, a dog somewhere, the ordinary world conducting itself at its ordinary volume. Geneva came over within an hour, because Geneva was that kind of neighbor, the kind who knows before you call them. She brought coffee and she sat with Mara on the porch and didn't say much. The mimosa tree moved in the small breeze and dropped its pink blossoms, which were there and then gone, which was the nature of mimosa blossoms. Mara had always found them a little heartbreaking for that reason, which she'd never told her mother, though maybe her mother had known. She sent an email to Achilles from her phone on the porch. She said her mother had passed and she wanted Achilles to know, and she confirmed that she would still be available for the trial as previously discussed. Achilles responded within 20 minutes. She said she was very sorry. She said there was no rush. She said everything was proceeding on track and Mara should take the time she needed. She didn't take much time. There wasn't in the end that much to take. The trial lasted 9 days. She didn't testify. The government's case was built largely on the documentary record, the body camera footage, the department GPS logs, the Facebook post metadata, the federal records request responses, the deposition testimony from Tara Fontenot and the other woman, whose name Mara knew but who had not wanted to be publicly identified, and whose court testimony was therefore handled with careful procedural protection. Mara's composition notebook was submitted as evidence, not in its entirety but in the excerpted form that Achilles's team had prepared, specific entries with specific dates that corresponded to the documented incidents. Dupree's made a case that was technically competent and emotionally fairly desperate. A good officer, a long record, the Facebook post a well-meaning if misguided attempt at public communication, the patrol increase a coincidence of normal activity. He put character witnesses on the stand, a little league parent, a retired deputy, a minister, who said the things character witnesses say, which were probably all true as far as they went, which was not very far in this context. Mara sat in the gallery for 3 of the 9 days. On the other days she was at home, working. On one of those days she went to the cemetery and sat in front of her mother's new stone for a while, which was a plain gray stone with her mother's name and 2 dates on it, and which said nothing else because Mara had not known what else to put and felt that the 2 dates were enough. They contained everything. On the 9th day, the jury deliberated for 7 hours, which was longer than Chen had expected and shorter than Dupree's had hoped, and they came back at 4:18 in the afternoon with guilty verdicts on 2 of the 3 civil rights counts and the obstruction count. The 3rd civil rights count, related to the stop involving Geneva, they deadlocked on because the documentation there was older and thinner. A mistrial declared on that count. Achilles had told her before the trial started that this was the most likely outcome on Geneva's count, and Mara had called Geneva to tell her in advance so that it wouldn't be a surprise. Geneva had said, "Does it matter about mine?" Mara had thought about it carefully. "It matters," she said, "it just isn't everything." "No," Geneva said, "it isn't." The sentencing was scheduled for September. The federal guidelines on Section 242, deprivation of rights resulting in bodily harm and obstruction, carried a potential of several years. What Pritchard would ultimately receive, she didn't know yet when she thought about it in the weeks after the verdict. She found she thought about it less than she'd expected to. It was a number that a judge would arrive at through a process, and the process was continuing, and her role in it was substantially finished. The DOJ pattern or practice investigation of the Carver Parish Sheriff's Department was ongoing, and would be for some time, and would ultimately result in a consent decree that would require independent monitoring of stops data and a restructured complaint process. Chief Willard retired before the consent decree was finalized. His retirement was not extended any ceremony by the DOJ. Tara Fontenot sent Mara a message in August that said she'd been promoted at her job and was thinking about applying to a criminal justice program at Old Lafayette part-time. She said she didn't know if she would. She said she thought maybe she should. Mara wrote back, "That sounds like you figuring out what you need to do," which was true from what she knew of her. On an evening in September, 3 days before the sentencing hearing, Mara sat on the front porch of the house on Millard Street in the last of the summer warmth. The mimosa tree was past its bloom by September, its leaves going yellow at the edges. She'd decided some weeks ago to sell the house. The decision had taken a long time and then happened all at once, the way decisions sometimes do. She was going to sell it and go back to Nashville, and she'd told herself she might feel something more complicated about that, but mostly what she felt was a simple kind of readiness. She had a glass of sweet tea and her composition notebook in her lap, though she wasn't writing in it. The pages near the back were still blank. She turned to the first page, which had Geneva's name at the top, and the date in August 14 months ago when they'd sat on this porch, and the description of what had happened in Geneva's own careful words, written out in Mara's careful hand. She turned through the pages slowly, not reading exactly, just moving through them. 70-some pages of dates and times and addresses and descriptions and the particular quality of things as they'd been. Documents that weren't the event themselves, were never the event themselves, but were the closest you could get to making something that had happened, stay real, stay in the world as a fact rather than dissipating into the general uncertainty of everything. She closed the notebook. Down the street a car went by, then another, the neighborhood settling into its evening sounds, a screen door, someone's television. Geneva's porch light coming on at the house 3 doors down, Geneva herself coming out to water the pots she kept along the railing, moving unhurriedly in the September warmth. She looked up and saw Mara and raised one hand in a wave, just a small one, and Mara raised hers back. The mimosa tree stood in the yard with all its yellow-edged leaves very still in the evening air. She thought she might leave the tree. She didn't know who would move into the house or what they'd make of it or whether they'd keep it or cut it down. That wasn't something she could control, and she'd learned, if she'd learned anything in the last 14 months, the precise and narrow width of what you could actually control, which was only what you wrote down, only what you kept, only the care you put into the record while everything else was still moving and unsettled around you. The care, the patience. The willingness to stay in a room with something uncomfortable for longer than anyone expected you to. Somewhere in the parish, Dale Pritchard was presumably in a house, thinking his own thoughts about what was coming, and she didn't imagine what those thoughts were. That was not her territory. She picked up her tea and held it with both hands and watched the tree. The branches were very still, then a small wind came through and they moved. And